On behalf of the Longview Chamber, let me begin by saying thank you to Citadel 6, our presenting sponsor of our Tech Talk series. So thank you very much, Citadel 6. And I know that we have John Andrews on the call, so glad that John is with us. Today's guest speaker is Mr. Tim Medin, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Tim. Tim is a senior instructor and course author at SANS, the most trusted and largest source for information security training and security certification in the world. Through the course of his career, Tim has performed penetration tests on a wide range of organizations and technologies. Tim has gained information security experience in a variety of industries, including previous positions in control systems, higher ed, financial services, and manufacturing. Tim is an experienced international speaker, having presented to organizations around the world. Tim is the creator of a really cool something called Kerber Roasting.
You can skip that part. I think I just copy and pasted the wrong bio for you.
Okay, we'll skip that part. But we're just excited to have Tim, who is with Red Siege. And Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you begin.
Gotcha. Okay, can you see my screen okay? Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for all showing up. I looked through the invitee list, and there's a few names that I recognized, I think. So it's nice to speak to the home crowd, although I wish we could have met at something like Silver Grizzly and had some coffee or a drink of some kind. It would have been a little bit nicer. By the way, the slides are available, redsiege.com/GGG. I travel a lot, and I just refer to cities by their airport code. So if you need to get the slides, feel free to do that. Yes, so I teach with the SANS Institute. I'm also the CEO of Red Siege. Been doing pen testing, offensive things for many years. My day job is doing penetration testing. So we do offensive security. Some of you might be not as familiar with that term, and that term, there's plenty of jokes about penetration testing. But what that really is organizations hire us to break in. So ideally, we're finding issues before the bad guys do. So what I want to do here is I want to talk through, like, what is the anatomy of a modern day breach? Because I'm sure you read about it all the time. Some of you may have had to deal with some of those issues, hopefully not. But kind of want to talk through, what does that look like? What are we seeing in the ecosystem here, in our environment with these various attackers, and then talk through some maybe techniques here to defend yourself, keep yourself out, keep the bad guys out. I know we have a big split. Some people are less technical. I recognized a couple of names that did some LinkedIn searches, and few people are more technical. I'm trying to thread the needle there. If you have questions along the way, please ask. You don't have to necessarily save them for the end, although I will be more than happy to answer any questions. Feel free to email me as well. Start off, let's talk about the attackers. What do we see in the real world attackers doing? The great research we have here, there's a paper from the Verizon, the Verizon Data Breach Report. The most recent one just came out last month, I think, or so. But let's take a look. What does it look like? Now, we probably all think that all the attackers are coming from the outside. The mythical Russians, we could pick on them right now, right? Whatever it might be, North Koreans, of course, they're going to be from all over the place. 83%, according to the data, of breaches are caused or done by external actors, which we would all expect that, right? Like a high number there. For me, at least, this really surprising number is this next one. It's like 1 in 5, right? Almost 20% is internal. Now, this doesn't mean that you've got someone on the inside at your company actively doing like hacking techniques. What this is probably going to be is, and I've talked to some local IT people or engineers in the area, and I've heard this very specifically locally, but this instance is recorded. I won't mention it. But it could be things like an engineer leaving their job to go to another organization and taking the drawings with them. taking the client list, contact information. I mean, it definitely could be, and there have been plenty of news articles where a sysadmin of some kind didn't get the raise, was fired, whatever it might be, and literally gave access away to the real threat actors to trigger some sort of ransomware event. Now, if you even mediocre at math, you'll notice, wait a second, 83 plus 19 is more than 100. That's because there are some times where it's actually both. This is the situation where I'm guessing by looking at the data, reading between the lines, it might be that sysadmin who is then selling access to a real ransomware actor, something like that. But we don't always have to think about our breaches being purely external. Everyone's always worried about the external access. That's not always the case, right? 1 in 5, that's a significant number. If we've got, how many people here? There's a few of you where if you had a breach, the statistical likelihood is that this internal access, internal user, a trusted person with access could be the cause of that breach. Now, when we watch all the TV shows, we, Tom Cruise and the, invariably beautiful woman trying to steal the phone from the Russian guy, put it back in his pocket, whatever. But if you watch all the TV shows, we think that all of this is because of what we call exploitation, unpatched software, something like that is causing or leads to what we call initial access, which allows the attacker in. But if you look at that second bar there, that exploiting a vulnerability, it's actually really small. And I can tell you, as the offensive person doing these kinds of assessments and these kinds of tests, last year I talked to my guys, said, how often did you get into an organization legally via an exploit? And they said, once, the entirety of last year. And I've got friends who do the same kind of thing, and they've asked their people, and very, very similar numbers. The vast majority of the time, it's stolen credentials. And I'm going to talk through these first couple of options in a little bit more depth, but the credentials are it's a very common way in. Significantly, it's really sad, because when you think about hacking, at least according to the TV shows, it looks super advanced, but it's actually kind of boring sometimes, because it's really poorly selected passwords, or a password that has been reused. So you use the same password at, let's say, LinkedIn. LinkedIn is compromised. LinkedIn also has your email address, and they use that email address and password combination all over the place, including where you work. Let's start off here. Let's get a little bit technical with some of the exploits. The reason that we see our, patch your systems, apply the updates, the attacks against those kinds of vulnerabilities is, honestly, it's getting hard. I've done this type of work before. It's incredibly difficult. It's hard. It's frustrating. It takes a lot of time. And there's a lot of protections we have now into the operating system, into the software, that makes this more difficult. When we see these sort of issues, and they are exploitable, so the attacker can get what we call our remote access, it's oftentimes with old vulnerabilities, not a brand new one that no one's known about. Realistically, it's issues we've honestly thought about and known about for years, truly years. Here's a screenshot. Let's take a look at this. So these are the CVEs here. These are a list of, the security issues, known issues with the pieces of software. This list here is the CISA's top exploited vulnerabilities, updated in April of 2022. So a little bit old, but if you look at that CVE number, it says CVE dash and then a number. That number is the year the issue was identified. right? And if you look at this list, if you look towards the bottom, we see a 2020, a 2019, a 2018. So these issues have been around for years. And again, these are the top routinely exploited vulnerabilities, the ones that it's most common. And on that list are issues that have been around for years. There's been patches for years, and people, unfortunately, just aren't patching. And if we could get that basic, just very simple set of patches in, that bad guy's not going to be able to get in, or they're going to have to take a different path. Now, the reason why, in my experience, the number of ways that we've gotten in with exploiting these vulnerabilities is so low, realistically, the companies that are doing penetration testing usually have a little bit more of a mature, more mature security program. I can't talk today. Whereas a lot of small businesses simply don't have that. And they think, well, what do I have that the bad guys are going to want? And realistically, these days, ransomware is the answer. If you've got computers and those computers are important to your organization at all, they take control of those and then end up using those against you. Here's another article, a little bit older here. This is from 2020. This is the NSA's list. And if you look at this list now, you can see things like 2015. So the right side, about fourth one down, 2019. So again, issues here that have been floating around for a while. And it's almost complete neglect of these systems. And if they're internet facing, you've got the bad guys just constantly scanning the internet, trying to find these things, exploiting them, and then, of course, many times deploying things like malware inside the organization. Now, how do you prioritize this? Well, we need to understand the systems, the process, things like that, right? How critical is the system where the patch is, right? How important is the data that this system touches? How reliable is that exploit? How likely is it that a real adversary is going to be able to execute the attack and gain access to your organization? Another key piece here is, where is it located? If it's on the internet, you can almost guarantee the attackers are going to find it, and they're going to find it quickly. Now, I know a lot of people, they're working on trying to patch their systems, and I made it sound super serious here, but there's a lot of vulnerabilities, a lot of these security issues that we see where realistically, the likelihood of some sort of negative impact is actually really, really small. But a lot of tools, some of the public notifications will report it as a super serious issue. And we see as IT and security teams end up spending a lot of time patching and fixing the systems that realistically don't matter. Either the system doesn't matter, the software flaw that you're fixing realistically isn't usable by an attacker. So it can get a little bit more difficult. One of the big things we hear about is the cryptography related to websites. That's called TLS, transport layer security. And we see, if you've ever looked at the, some of the security scanners, they rate some of these issues as super critical, which is not realistic. Even if you're the NSA, GCHQ, whatever government organization, the likelihood of any sort of tiny data leak is extremely small. And oftentimes, if you ever read these advisories, it's something like, well, if I can get 3 gigabytes of data, I can extract 2 bytes of the text so that I can read it. And you're like, fine, I'll give you the 2 bytes. Like, it doesn't really matter. So as the IT team, as the security team, we really do need to reevaluate some of this internally before we end up just in this never-ending cycle of trying to patch and trying to fix these systems that realistically, it just doesn't matter. All right, let's talk a little bit about phishing. Phishing, I talked to my friends who do incident response and forensics. So kicking the bad guys out after the initial compromise, identifying the way into the organization. And I asked them, I said, hey, what is the most common way in? They're like, phishing. Okay, cool. I'm like, Eric, what's the second most common way in? And he told me, well, Tim, it's phishing. I'm like, well, Eric, if I ask you what the third one is, are you gonna tell me phishing again? He's like, why don't you try me and ask? I'm like, all right, Eric, what's the third one? Phishing. I'm like, all right, jerk. But we see this time and time again. The phishers are getting better and better, and there's technology we have available that can actually help them. Now, if you get a really well-crafted email, it's going to be hard for your users to differentiate, right? If we get this email and the grammar is terrible and it's addressed to, like in my case, Mr. Medin, no one calls me Mr., right? We don't typically address each other as Mr. or Mrs. these days. If the grammar is really funny, the word choice is a little bit odd, right? Like I'm a barrister. You're like, well, here we call that a lawyer, right? Those are easy to identify. But with things like ChatGPT, we can get a better story. So even from a part of the world where their English isn't as strong, where they use different terminology, we can use some of these tools here to really polish this. Now, this doesn't make really good phishers better. It makes the poor and mediocre ones better. One of the things I do and my team does all the time is we do phishing assessments. What we find to be highly effective is if you tailor it exactly for that organization, where you have some kind of knowledge about people, processes, whatever, good grammar, punctuation in there, some sort of urgency, some sort of limited timeline on this, ends up increasing the click-through rate. The hard part, though, is, of course, stopping all of this, right? And I'll come back to that in a little bit. As I mentioned, we've seen the rise of AI here, and we're seeing an impact with phishing. I don't know about you, but I'm seeing more emails make it into my inbox today than I saw even just a year ago. And a lot of that has to do with whatever AI, I hate using the term over and over again, AI, software, whatever it might be, it's modifying the email. So changing the word choice, changing the format, changing the layout so that it doesn't always look the same, and it's harder for the filters to detect and then filter out. And again, the rise of AI here, the AI doesn't make the really good targeted phishers better, but it makes the crappy ones much better. And we're going to see a lot more of this as we continue. We've seen things, for example, if you've got a phishing email from Microsoft, right? It's just that 4 squares. Some of the things people used to do is put the actual Microsoft logo in. They've got more intelligent where they'll create like a table, kind of like you would in Excel, and put the colors in. They'll adjust the colors once again with tiny little mutations so that any sort of signature against that is going to be significantly more difficult to fingerprint. And then we might see more of that slip into our inbox. Now, how in the world do you defend against this? Well, everybody's doing phishing training, right? Now, the phishing training realistically is only so effective. Realistically, people are just trying to do their jobs. They're just trying to get stuff done. And they get this email with some sort of sense of urgency. They just want to complete their job and complete this task so they can move on to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. And if you've got a very tailored phishing email, it's really hard for people to identify that, right? And the problem isn't the users. We like to complain about users. You might hear things like, well, there's no patch for human stupidity. you can't patch the users, things like that. But realistically, if the entire IT infrastructure is only safe because someone didn't click on an email, that's the real problem. That's the real problem. Like, why is one person clicking on an email able to damage the entire organization? To be effective here, what you need, of course, we want to keep the bad guys out, but we also need to focus on detection. So knowing once they get in, and then responding so we can kick them out very quickly. And we're seeing like ransomware operators getting faster and faster and faster, but in deploying their malware. So they get in. It used to be that the bad guys would sit in there for months. Now we're seeing that ransomware getting faster and faster and faster. So we do have to detect and respond very, very quickly. All right, let's spend some time on passwords. Passwords, as I mentioned before, significant issue when it comes to security. Again, I feel like I'm cheating when it comes to the passwords and hacking and pen testing. Now, you've probably all been given the recommendations to rotate your passwords my guess is 90 days, because why? Nobody knows where this 90 days came from. Moses did not come down from the mountain with a third tablet that said, thou shalt change thy passwords every 90 days. Like, my guess, it was two dudes, definitely got to be dudes, sitting in a conference room trying to come up with a standard with how often should we change passwords. And like Todd leans over to Scott and it's like, hey, how long? I don't know. How many days are in a year? 360 something. Todd and Scott aren't even good at math, right? Like, well, what if we did it 4 times a year? What is that? I don't know, about 90 days, right? And we've got this thing now that we just can't get rid of, that we're supposed to change our passwords every 90 days. And the reason is, the rationale is, well, if the attacker gets in, if we change our passwords, they're not going to be able to maintain access for longer than 90 days. Well, the attackers don't need 90 days. They're in for a much shorter period of time before they're stealing your data, or in this case, in many cases, executing the ransomware. We also hear about the complexity requirements, right? We need upper, lower, specials, numbers in there. Everybody knows the cheats to get around those. And the modern recommendations from NIST, the National Institute of Standards, and I forgot the T off the top of my head, Microsoft, Google, they are recommending against these things. And I'll come back to some of the reasons why in just a moment here. The rotation, we talked about some of this. If we look at some of the older Verizon breach reports, which is the best data we have for widespread information about a lot of these breaches, we see that the dwell time, the time these attackers are in our networks, is oftentimes 5 or 6 months, which is like 2 rotations, which means that rotation policy is not doing what it was designed to do. However, what it does do is it makes people pick worse passwords, right? If you've ever worked on January 2nd, I can almost guarantee January 2nd, you called the help desk at some point and said, yes, can I have my password reset? And if you've ever worked the help desk, January 2nd, you hate life because the entire day is, can I reset my password? So what users do is they move to simpler passwords, or they move to a scheme that they can memorize. One of the ones that we regularly see, and do not do this, is, well, the password has to change every 90 days. You know what else also changes every 90 days? The season. So like right now, they would use summer, right? Capital S, lowercase ummer. But of course, that's not long enough, right? Because complexity requirements, and we also need numbers and special characters. There's a summer this year. Ideally, there's a summer next year. So they probably think for 45 minutes to an hour, what number could I put at the end of the password of summer to distinguish this summer from next summer? And of course, that answer, summer 2023. And then 90 days, fall or autumn 2023. Again, do not do this. Please do not do this. But as the attackers, we see this all the time. And we see like, oh, well, but now I need a secure password, which means we need to add a special character. So what does everybody do to add to the password to make it a secure password? Adds the exclamation point to the end, right? Why? Top left key on the keyboard. On top of that, if you want to make a secure password, there's things that you always do or people regularly do. You take an A and you convert it to a @ symbol, right? The I becomes a 1, right? True story. I was doing a talk in Dallas a few years ago. And if you've ever watched, it's one of those home remodeling shows with Chip and Joanna Gaines. They opened for me. I presented after, well, they went first as the big thing, and then everybody left, and I did mine because no one wants to talk to the security guys, and everyone loves Chip and Joanna. But whatever, I like to say they opened for me. But I was talking through passwords, and I said, don't do this kind of stuff. Don't take the A, convert it to an @ because every attacker knows this. In fact, there's an entire language we used to use in the 90s, and still a little bit today, called leet speak, where we do exactly that. And this guy comes over, true story. He's like, yeah, but Tim, I do more than that. And he looks at me. He's like, I know you mentioned the A to @ but what I do, and no joke, the dude looks around like there's like North Korean spies in the room waiting for this nugget of security information. He's like, I take an O and I change it to, looks around, a 0. I'm like, oh yeah. Do you also take an L? Now I'm like, well, maybe I should look around. Maybe there is somebody here, and convert it to a 1. He's like, yeah. Don't do that. Right? Everybody knows this. Everybody knows these sorts of tricks. It makes it harder for people to remember. As an attacker, we know these trivial replacements, and we try these very common guesses all the time. Common guesses include things like the season and year. Again, do not do this. The organization name and number, breached passwords. We'll come back to that in just a moment. I was doing a presentation for a company in Portugal. And before the presentation, I grabbed everybody's email address, looked on some special sites that I have access to, nothing super fancy. And I took their email address and I looked at breached passwords. So what happens with these breached passwords is you create an account on one site. I'm going to pick on LinkedIn here. And that site maybe is then compromised. And I'm sure you all have accounts all over the place. And I know plenty of people, my friends included, who are like, yeah, this is my secure password. This is the one I use all over the place. And what happens then if LinkedIn or whatever website is compromised, the attackers will oftentimes publish hashed versions of the passwords. It's kind of like encryption if you're not familiar with the term. And then what people like me and many others, including the bad guys, will do is take those passwords, crack them, and get the original password. And of course, now they have the email address, they have the password, and they start using this all over the place. So what I did is I did some searches for this company in Portugal. And I was talking through this, and in the next slide, I put 70 different passwords for people inside the organization. And I saw, a couple of people, we had cameras up. I saw a couple of people like immediately like hide their camera. Some other people like absolute panic. Some other people just laughed. But I can't tell you, please don't reuse those passwords, even if it's the secure passwords. In fact, here's on the screen is one of the passwords that I used to use. Exodus 01 with a capital X. And if you can guess here, I probably at some point use Exodus 02, same scheme we all use, or the secure version, Exodus 01 with the exclamation point at the end. Now, what do we do here? The modern guidance here is to stop the rotation. Stop the rotation unless there is a suspected compromise of the password. This allows people to pick better passwords. Stop with the crazy complexity requirements. What's really important, what's more important when it comes to the math is a long password. A long password. And it doesn't have to be crazy with all the weird characters. Pick a sentence, pick a phrase, pick something like that you can easily remember and frankly, easily type. Even better, use a password manager. There's plenty of different options out there for password managers. I only know 4 passwords. I can unlock my computer. I can log into my computer. Yes, 2 different passwords because I traveled to some sketchy places. My password for my password manager, and I can unlock my phone. That's it. Everything else is in my password manager. It syncs between my phone, my iPad, my computer. And I just use that. They're long, they're random, and most importantly here, they're unique. Now, if you're in the IT side, what we really want to do, because you really can't do anything to prevent somebody from reusing the password. Because if they reuse their password at the company, they reuse the password at something like LinkedIn, you have absolutely no way of knowing that, right? As the IT team, though, what we can do is look for bad passwords. Like I talked about the season and year. We'll ban passwords with summer, winter, fall, autumn, spring, right? Some people get past the length requirements by just smashing a character over and over again. Look at some of that to prevent some of that. The real option here is looking at MFA, right? Our MFA, our multi-factor, our modern authentication, 2-factor authentication makes life a lot better. Some services don't support it. I do have to have my phone laying around to do this, so it can make it a little bit more difficult for people. If you're on the IT team or if you're working with them, do you know which of your services do not support it? Do you know which ones do? As an attacker, though, this is not 100%. There's still tools, in this case, Evil Jinx. There's also consent attacks. I don't want to get too terribly technical there, but there's still ways to attack the multi-factor. So it's not the be-all, end-all, but it does make it much, much better. So highly recommend that. If you can use that for any service, highly recommended to do things like that. The real important piece, identify the risk, right? We need to think about the risk. When you're working at your organization, what data, process, if lost, stolen, compromised, or destroyed, would have the biggest impact to the organization? And then design defenses around that. Prioritize the patching and passwords for those more sensitive computers and look at the paths to get to some of those as well. A lot of organizations are very worried about their privileged accounts. We call this domain admin. This is the one account, or I guess there's multiple as well. This is the account permission that gives access to everything inside of most organizations. However, the attackers don't always need this. Think about the attacker that gains initial access. Their first point of contact inside the organization is on the engineer's computer. And the engineer has access to all the sensitive information. Or the person in finance and their computer is compromised and they have access to the bank accounts or financial information for other people or the bank accounts for the company itself and can initiate ACHs. We see these kind of things all the time. And as IT people, as security people, I often see a lot of defenses put around these very sensitive, technology accounts. But there's a lot of other really important access inside the organization that has nothing to do with this privileged IT access. All right, let's talk through a little bit now. What is the process, or what do we commonly see here with the breach? I'm going to get a little bit technical here. Not too bad, though. An important thing to do is to go into the assumption like, hey, what if one of these defenses fail? Right? What happens if? I hear a lot of people say, well, we have phishing filters. We have antivirus. Okay, cool. What happens if those fails? Like, well, but according to our salesperson, we have the industry's best AV and filtering software. Okay, fine. But if you ever read a news story about an organization that was compromised and ransomwared, or just compromised in general, do you think they had AV? Well, of course. They'd be negligent if they did. Do you think they had filtering on their email? Do you think they trained their users? Well, yeah. Realistically, why are you significantly different from them? Honestly, a lot of it is luck. So it's always important to test or to think about the different layers to security, because what if that EDR, that AV fails? Or more importantly, when it fails. Because you can get around that stuff. My guys on my team do this kind of stuff all the time. There are ways around all of these things. What's behind it? What's protecting once we have that initial access from one of the bad guys? A great scenario here. One of the guys on my team wrote this blog post. I have a similar story. I was doing some work for a company, and they do investments, but they do investments for the very rich. Okay, I think if I remember correctly, to knock on their door, you had to have like $10 million to invest. Not just $10 million in wealth, $10 million of, I'm going to go invest this. Right? So not exactly a bunch of chumps. And I was doing the pen test here, the assessment, and it was just painful. Couldn't get anywhere, couldn't move to other systems, having a horrible time getting some access to other stuff. And all we did is look around the network. Took a look around the network. And there's file shares all over the place. And on the file shares were bank account and routing numbers, a lot of them with bank account and routing numbers for those very loaded accounts. I'm like, man, like I only need like one of those accounts to retire very nicely and never come back to the US, right? And we see this quite literally at 100% of the assessments that we do, that there's some file share somewhere with too much information. We see things like passwords out there, typically very privileged passwords. We find very critical, very important intellectual property, a lot of financial information. And there are tools, I know some of you are technical folks, there are tools where you can look for some of that yourself. One of the great tools I love is PowerView. So with PowerView, you can use the Find Interesting Domain Share File, horrible name, by the way. And what this does is it looks around your network for the file shares and then looks through the files for sensitive information, including things like the word password, secret. It also looks for specific file types that are going to be much more interesting, like virtual machine files, VMDK files, and a number of other things. And of course, you can fully customize this. As a defender, as an IT professional, I highly recommend running this yourself. You don't even need a security person to run this, but analyze and see what is out there. And then, of course, clean up. Another great thing, completely freely available, another tool that to identify what an attacker is likely going to do on your network is called Bloodhound. Again, freely available tool. What this does is it gathers information from the network and the computers on the network, and it literally builds a graph on how to get from this low-level user to important information. And it builds the graph. And what it allows you to do is say, oh, I see that we've got a permissions problem here that allows a regular user to access this very sensitive account because of X, Y, and Z. And again, freely available. You can run this yourself. There's lots of blog posts and videos out there to help with some of those things. One of the most important things, you cannot defend systems you don't know exist. I can't tell you how many times when I was doing some sort of test and we find a way in, we find a system, and they're like, well, that wasn't supposed to be there. Like, well, it is. In fact, I remember a number of years ago, a friend of mine, Ollie, he was working on a test, and what happened is they had this development network on the internet, which, by the way, if you put something directly on the internet, expect bad things to happen. And what happened is he compromised their entire network coming in through that development network. And the IT team, or the head of the IT came back and said, well, that's not fair. You're not supposed to use that. I mean, what are you going to do? Call up Vladimir in Moscow and be like, comrade, that's not cool. You can't compromise us that way. We didn't mean to do that. Can you give us our computers back? And he, of course, he's going to laugh his face off and say, you know what, I'm just raising the price of the ransomware. Right. So we got to understand, what do we have? What do we have exposed? We need to understand, some of the patching and the vulnerabilities we have in our network. And really important is understand which ones matter. And what we're seeing here is the attackers are getting faster and faster. If there's a public code or the public exploit for a specific vulnerability for an internet-facing piece of software, the attackers go after that very, very quickly. We have to patch this quickly before the attackers can get in and gain a foothold. Of course, training is always important. We need to help our users understand the phishing emails, but also help the security team, the IT team, identify, like, hey, something's wrong here. Something's funny here, and maybe this helps you identify the attacker that's already in the organization, and hopefully we kick them out very quickly. All right, so that's going to wrap things up. I don't know if we have questions. By the way, the slides are available, redsiege.com/GGG. I don't know how we close this out. Sorry.
Sorry about that. This is John Andrews.
Sure.
Kelly asked me to help you close this out. So folks, we are going to be taking some questions from the gallery here.
Right. I see one in the chat. So Brian's asking, what password manager do you recommend? I personally use 1Password. I really like what they've done with their security. LastPass, it's kind of got a bad name. They had some poor choices, shall we say. I believe all that's been resolved. So it's not going to be as significant of an issue like it once was. But 1Password is my preferred password manager. I love it.
Yeah, see, I was going to mention that I knew that OneLogin had been hacked and LastPass, and because when you brought it up, I was like, well, people need to be aware of that for sure. When you're putting all your eggs in one basket. So good recommendations, though.
Cool. Any other questions, folks?
I have on what length password would you feel most comfortable with?
So I'm gonna give you
passphrase.
Yeah, I'm gonna give you the long-winded answer, unfortunately. So the common guidance is 15 characters. But honestly, it's because of some old technology. It's a little bit funky how that came about. Now, for the regular user, I mean, really, just type part of a sentence. It doesn't have to be that bad. Our policy, of course, we're a security company, is 20 characters minimum. But again, we use a password manager. It fills it out automatically, so I don't have to type anything crazy. But the recommendation is 14, 15 characters.
Okay. All right, good. Any other questions? Let's see. Has your team ever been unable to penetrate an organization?
Yeah, so that a lot of that comes down to realistically the scope, what we're allowed to do and not allowed to do, and then a lot of the timing. You know, the rule of thumb is given enough time and energy, you can basically get into anywhere, right? Now we'll have some pen tests where it's like you can only look at this part of the network and you're not allowed to call and you're not allowed to email. Like, well, in that case, realistically, no. If we're allowed to call, you can almost always get somebody to give you some kind of password, some kind of sensitive information. The phishing, again, super effective, either to get credentials or to get some sort of payload to run on someone's computer. So short answer is yes, but a lot of it comes down to scope and the type of test.
That makes sense. Okay, I think we have time for at least one more. Anyone?
I see Catherine typing.
Uh-oh. Okay, here's one.
Sure.
What is the most one thing that everyone should come away from this discussion?
If I can get all of you, assuming you're not in the IT team, if I can get all of you to go away with one thing, it would be unique passwords in a password manager. Like that is the one thing that just makes so many problems just completely disappear.
Yep, that makes sense. And then Catherine, how long do you normally spend on a pen test?
Yeah, so a lot of that depends. Most of ours, and it depends internal, external, all sorts of different stuff. Most of them are about 2 weeks. Now, if we get into what's called a red team, the red team is basically no holds barred. Those can take longer because you're trying to be typically very stealthy. Those can take typically like 2 months. But the vast majority of pen tests where the IT team knows you're coming and you're not trying to be stealthy, it's somewhere between 1 and 3 weeks, typically.
Okay, cool. And I know you brought up the NIST password requirements changing, and that's going to take some time to trickle down into the different compliances.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah. So that might be something useful to mention to folks as well, because there's PCI and HIPAA and all these other things.
Oh, PCI is terrible. PCI recommends 7-character passwords, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, they're a little behind.
Yeah.
Pro is going to be have some updates to that. Okay. If we don't have any others, I think that was an excellent excellent talk, Tim. We really appreciate it. Catherine, do you have anything else for us?
Which Catherine?
Oh, I'm sorry. The good one. I'm sorry, Ms. Camp. That would be you, Ms. Camp.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was amazing.
Yeah, thank you. Anytime.
Well, I guess we're wrapping up then. So thank you guys so much. We'll see you hopefully next month with our next Tech Talk.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Happy to answer questions anytime. But have a good one.
Definitely. Tim, you take care.